GDP numbers came out this morning, negative, minus 0.3% on that front. Expectations were for positive 0.3% return. So concern there, lowest numbers since Q2 of 22. But the devil is always in the details. And nobody is doing a better job on that front I've seen this morning than E.J. Antoni, Heritage Foundation. He's on X at Real E.J. Antoni, and he joins us on KCMO. All right, EJ, just give me, as you are going through some of these numbers that just dropped in the last couple of hours, what is a theme that you are seeing here?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The devil is in the details. And look, we saw the same thing under Biden. It's amazing how, depending on the internals of these reports, a good headline number could actually be a bad report, and vice versa. A bad headline number could be a good report. What happened under Biden for quarter after quarter? You constantly had runaway government spending that was adding statistically to GDP, and that made it look like the economy was growing, even as people were suffering. Today, we're seeing exactly the opposite. Not only did Trump manage to slow the growth of government spending, government purchases in the first quarter, they actually declined slightly. That was really, really good news. At the same time, consumer spending continues to grow. But the real thing that made the number negative today wasn't just the negative government spending. It was the huge surge in imports. They jumped 40%. I mean, that's almost unheard of. The reason for that is people were trying to get ahead of tariffs. In other words, they were trying to import stuff into the U.S. before a tariff could be placed on it. And the result of that was a reduction in GDP.
So why would front-loading on goods to avoid tariffs result in the GDP going negative?
Great question. So this is just goes down to how we calculate GDP. You basically add together consumer spending, investment, government purchases, and then a category we call net exports. And if you look within net exports, exports themselves add to GDP, but imports subtract. And so if imports and exports are both rising at the same amount, there's no actual impact on GDP. But if we all of a sudden start exporting a ton of stuff around the world, that's a sign the economy's growing. If, however, all we're doing is importing, that's a sign the economy's declining. So we subtract imports from GDP, and the result in this instance, as you put it, people are trying to get ahead of tariffs. It shows up as negative GDP. But the funny thing is, next quarter, the second quarter, what will happen is you won't have all of those imports coming in, because what should have been imported in the second quarter was imported in the first. So a huge drop in imports next quarter will show up as a surge in GDP.
This is amazing. I am so glad that we are having you on the show right now, EJ, because this is exactly what people I need to understand. So the way the data is calculated is driven in part, of course, by the imports. People front-loaded on the imports in Q1 to get ahead of the tariffs, and that makes the GDP number look negative. Now, I know you're not a market guy. You're an economist. But in classic Wall Street fashion, the Dow is off 500 points so far. And CNBC says Dow drops more than 500 points. Sell-off intensifies following negative GDP data. It would seem to me that Wall Street is continuing to act like a teenage girl here. Is that what your read is on this right now?
I think so. Again, especially as you dive into the internals, as you look under the hood of this report, another really positive development was you had investment, and that's the real long-run driver of economic growth, by the way. Investment exploded almost 22%. That's huge, especially when you consider the fact that in the previous quarter, the fourth quarter of last year, that was the last quarter of the Biden administration, private domestic actually turned negative. It was shrinking, not growing. So again, really great news that we're not only back into positive growth territory, but exploding. And the other crazy thing is that not only is the headline number drowning out the details of the report, but it's even drowning out other reports. So today we also got what's called the personal consumption expenditures, or it's from the Personal Income and Outlays report from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the same folks who put out the GDP report. I know this is a lot of acronyms, I'm sorry, but basically what it showed in the report today was that inflation, whether you include energy and food prices or not, or you just use the headline number, or whatever the case may be, inflation flatlined for the month of March. In other words, despite a huge increase in inflation, a big jump in prices in January, by the time we got to March, there was no inflation. The average price level stayed flat. There were zero increases. That's phenomenal news. So in a single quarter, we basically went from high inflation to no inflation. That's really, really welcome news.
All right. EJ Antoni with the Heritage Foundation is here. So let me ask you this. You shared this morning on X, consumer spending, and you referenced it a few minutes ago. Consumer spending outpaced government purchases in this GDP report by 3.2 percentage points. Best number since Q2 of 2022. That's also the last time government purchases declined. And you write here, this is fantastic news. Why, beyond the obvious, why is it fantastic news for the short term and the long term of the economy to see consumer spending, even though it's down, from the last couple of quarters, outpacing government purchases by this number?
Well, a couple of reasons. One has to do with the inflation figures we were just discussing. So if you can get the government spending down, since government spending is the ultimate driver of inflation, then you're actually going to have a very positive impact on prices. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. The other thing is that the government is already much too big. It's a fifth of the economy. That's not sustainable. During most of our history and the period of our history when we had the fastest economic growth and the greatest improvement in the standard of living of the common man, that was when the government was only about 3, 4, maybe 5% of the overall economy. So you have to get government spending down to a sustainable level. The reason why the debt is exploding so much today, why it's costing us well over $1 trillion a year to service that debt, is specifically because the private sector economy is not growing fast enough to sustain the growth in the public sector, the government. So you need to get government, not only the growth to stop increasing, you need to get the growth negative. In other words, get government to decline. At the same time, you keep the private sector growing. That's what's happening with deregulation. We can expect more of that as the tax cut package gets across the finish line. And hopefully, very soon, we can get trade deals inked with countries like India, like Japan, Australia, and that will have a very positive impact on international trade and again, keeping the private sector growing.
Awesome. I want to ask you, lastly, a 35,000-foot question. You mentioned government growth. One problem that we have here in the Kansas City area that I don't think is unique to us, but is government growth at the county and municipal levels that are just, blowing things out of the water. Their budget's up 30, 40, 50% over the last 3 to 5 years in some cases. What is the end game for these municipalities and these counties that can't just print money like the feds can? And how big of a problem is this nationwide?
Oh, it's huge. And I think education is probably a great example of this, since that's where a lot of the government money at the local level goes. What we're basically seeing is what we've already seen in universities and colleges, where local school districts are hiring by just the dozens upon dozens administrators and other staff that have nothing to do with actually teaching students. It's crazy to think that you have districts now where there are more non-teacher staff than teachers. I thought you were in the business of teaching students. What's going on here? Mm-hmm. So you have to get the government spending down. You have to start firing these people in these essentially non-essential jobs. There's just no other way to do it. This was actually one of the contributing factors to the Great Depression. It was the continued bloat within local government that drove up tax rates. We didn't just increase taxes in the Depression at the federal level. We were increasing them at the fastest pace ever at the state and local level too.
Really? And obviously that result was an absolute mess. And sometimes, I guess, you got to go 100 years before people need to be taught the same lesson all over again, huh?
Exactly. And this is actually why Art Laffer and Brian Dimitrovic, in their book Taxes Have Consequences, they label state and local governments as the unindicted co-conspirators of the Great Depression, because everybody forgets the fact that they raised taxes too, just like the federal government did, and it crushed the private sector for a decade.
Well said. Hey, EJ, great spot. Thank you for fitting us in this morning in the wake of this report. I know you're pouring through the numbers right now. Find him on X, Real EJ Antoni. That's where he's at, and we've been sharing his stuff all morning long. Well done, EJ. Thank you for being here on KCMO in Kansas City.
Thank you for having me.
Great stuff there. Heritage Foundation economist EJ Antoni on KCMO. That is great. It's just like, remember the Biden job numbers would come out, And all of Biden's lackeys will be like, whoa, he blew out the number, man. And then we'd go into the Bureau of Labor Statistics and be like, wait, the government was the number one employer of jobs again this month. It was always in the top 2 or 3, sometimes number 1. And it was like, this is not sustainable. It's not the real economy. Now, the way he just broke that down on this GDP number was fantastic. So people front load to get ahead of tariffs in Q1. And when you actually put together the calculation for how you get to your GDP number, right now the economy looks like it's taking in more here in the United States than it's exporting. But a lot of that is to get ahead of the tariffs. So now if people don't import in Q2 at the levels they should be because they did a lot of it in Q1, you're going to have a GDP number that's going to look much better coming up here in 3 months. So that's the kind of stuff that needs to be talked about in the wake of this number this morning.